Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome back your host, enthusiastically, Jamie Ian Swiss.
It wasn't me. Thanks for the nice intro, Michael. Thank you. It's great to be back. We're going to get started with a panel, and it really is my pleasure. Sometimes I just get paid to lie, but it really is my pleasure to introduce this gentleman. He is a science writer who served as the editor-in-chief of Scientific American magazine from 1994 till 2009, the youngest editor in their history, actually. And during his tenure, the magazine twice won National Magazine Awards for editorial excellence with the single topic issues What You Need to Know About Cancer in 1996 and A Matter of Time in 2002. And his 2002 article, 15 Answers to Creationist Nonsense, is one of the most read and downloaded articles in the history of scientificamerican.com. And even though we know that there is a ton of resources about that subject matter, I highly recommend that particular piece to you as a very cogent and succinct addressing of the subject. In 2000, he was the recipient of the Sagan Award for Public Understanding of Science, bestowed by the Council of Scientific Society Presidents, and in 2003, the Potomac Institute for Policy Studies honored him with its Navigator Award for distinguished service in support of national science and technology policy. He's a frequent commentator on scientific matters for television and radio. He serves as a trustee to the James Randi Educational Foundation and is a member of the Board of Advisors to the New York City Skeptics, for whom he presented our very first lecture in our series of public lectures. I will add, not always included in his bio, but it's my pleasure to add it, that he also worked by night as a sketch and improvisational comic in New York, Boston, and college venues. And during the days, his major hobby is the study of karate, in which he holds the rank of Yondan, 4th degree black belt. So sit up and don't act up. Please welcome my friend John Rennie. John!
Friend. I'm a friend.
Go get him, buddy.
Thanks. Oh, thanks. Well, this is so great. Thanks very much. And I hope we just want to check everybody can hear me okay in the back of the room. Excellent. Okay, because this is very good, because I have to begin, and I hope I'll sort of beg the indulgence of our panel here for just a moment, who I'll bring out here in just a second. They commenting, those of you who of course were here earlier in the morning, you may have heard my name pop up earlier in the discussion when James Randi was giving his video presentation about that. And at that point he was in a very gentlemanly way. He was talking about how he had dropped me a note gently chastising me for having been associated with this program full of some kind of end of the world craziness or whatever. And and how I became involved with some of that is maybe that's something we'll get into later on as we get into the question and answer portion of things. But just so you know, this is why this constituted one of the worst moments of my life earlier this morning, because I never got that note from James Randi. The fact is I completely agreed with James about all of that, and I'm going to have to get in touch with him because I don't really know what happened with that note. But that in itself is maybe sort of an interesting note having to do with this question about media and skepticism and science and odd kind of irresponsibilities about all of that. We take it for granted that the media are supposed to be the watchdogs in society and are supposed to bring a kind of robust, healthy skepticism and scrutiny to reporting of the news of the world's events. But unfortunately, we've all can sort of flinch at the far too many numerous failures of exactly that sort of thing, and you can pretty much take your pick of everything of reports, credulous reports on ghosts or psychics or UFOs or creationism tricked out as science or 9/11 trutherism or medical quackery or climate change denial, or it's a very long list. It even gets into some kind of matters of obvious national and international import, things like matters of weapons of mass destruction, or even things like whether or not the president is actually a citizen of the United States. It's very, very strange. And so over and over again, we see these kinds of examples of misinformation or disinformation making their way out into print or the airwaves or online, and they are not adequately being rebutted, if indeed in some cases they even should have been allowed out at all. And that's sort of an interesting gatekeeper function that we may want to talk about later on. I have to say, sort of in defense of kind of people of my own journalistic profession in this, a lot of the people in this are, not too surprisingly, they are smart, committed, sincere people who want to be trying to tell the truth and better informing people. And so when you look at these failures, I think all you can really say is that it's really interesting to see what the effect of the pressures of deadlines or economic constraints or some of the other kinds of tradition of journalism about like balance and so forth, and balance in reporting on some kinds of issues, how that lends itself to the spread of some kinds of misinformation, which I don't offer in any way as an excuse, just as a sort of an observation about all of that. I think it's also just worth noting here that when we talk about the media, media is obviously an extremely broad term. Partly we're acknowledging the fact that it's not just print and not just airwaves or whatever else anymore, but partly that also acknowledges what is the very real fact that, unlike the way it was, say, more than a generation ago, the news divisions of some of the big media organizations are no longer often separate from the entertainment divisions. They are often controlled by the same people, they have the same management, and are answering to the same bottom line. And I think as a result of that, there are subtle pressures that can also influence what happens in journalism, because I think one of the things that results in that is, picking up off Paul Offit this morning had mentioned that, the great saying about that the job of journalism is to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. If you are neither one of the afflicted nor the comfortable, it's all good theater. And to the extent to which journalism, sometimes because of the various directives, is all just about the theater, about the controversy, about the screaming, that in itself lends itself to a kind of unfortunate even-handedness between information and misinformation, because it's all good fun and we can juggle it around. And I think it also, we've seen like the influence of the rise of a lot of sorts of pseudo-documentary programs, some of which unfortunately I apparently have been associated with, and also talk shows, everything from Rush Limbaugh and Glenn Beck to Oprah. And they answer to their own sort of rules or not for what constitutes responsible journalism. And what can I even say about something like ghost hunters? Today we're going to have a really good chance to try to discuss some of these sorts of matters, and we're going to have a particular emphasis on a subject that we've already touched on, but medical quackery, because they're, in some ways, the examples of this are so clear-cut that we can come to, and we can look at how the ways in which that very cruelly preys on the frightened and the desperate. And we have put together a wonderful panel for addressing these matters, and let me actually just bring out those people now if I can. They consist of, come on out folks, all together once. There we are. Please welcome, if you will, medical researcher Rachael Dunlop and pediatric clinician John Snyder and journalist, and journalist Howard Schneider. And later on we'll actually be joined, sorry for cutting off your own line. Later on, we'll actually also be getting joined in a discussion by well-known science writer Carl Zimmer, who will also be speaking later on the panel. So we're just going to have, in terms of format here, I'm going to let each of our panelists have a few minutes to give sort of a general, a few sort of opening statements and stake out a position of interest and some of their own experience with some of these matters. Then we'll have a little bit of discussion amongst the panelists in this way. And then we really want to open things up to you in the audience, because I think the Q&A portion of this is the best and most vital and most active part of what we can have. And it's a great way for us to pick up on topics that will be getting raised in this discussion and in some of the ones that came up earlier today as well. So with that in mind, let me just start off by introducing the first of our panelists, who is Dr. Rachael Dunlop, who comes to us from Australia, where she works full-time in heart disease research, but she also co-organizes the Sydney Skeptics Meetup Group. You may know her best as a reporter on the Skeptic Zone podcast, where she presents the popular segment Dr. Rachael Reports. And yes, I applaud away. Don't be stingy with that applause. Yes. And she also contributes to the think tank And she's also a blogger for the Skeptic's Book of Poo-Poo and the Skeptic Zoners. So, and apparently, because there are more than 24 hours in the day in Australia, she also still manages to find time to be part of the Mystery Investigators Science Show for schools, along with well-known scientist and skeptic Richard Saunders. So, Rachel?
Thanks very much, John. So, hi everyone. Some of you may know me as Dr. Rachael from the Skeptic Zone, and some of you may know that I also do a lot of work in Australia, lobbying the media, trying to pretty much give the anti-vaxxers a bit of a smackdown, actually, which is my primary, that's the primary work I do. But before I tell you a little bit about that, I'm going to tell you a little bit about what else I do with respect to the media. I do a lot of research for journalists in Australia. I'm on a list now, so I get lots and lots of phone calls from journos when they have usually an issue involving quackery or alternative medicine. And we have shows in Australia that are kind of like magazine shows. A Current Affair is one of them, where, you know, they're credulous evening shows where they will tout the most amazing miracle cures and, you know, creams that will do everything, that sort of stuff. But occasionally they call me, and there's a product known as LifeWave, which is a magic, it's a magic patch. I don't know if you guys have heard of it, but it's homeopathic, it's infrared, it uses photobiomodulation, it uses nanotechnology, it's non-transdermal, but it can still increase the levels of glutathione in your blood by 300% in 24 hours. Right. Amazing. It's multi-level marketing, so I can give you the address later and then I can move up the pyramid and we're all happy. But I recently did a story in Australia for this product, and it's sold by a guy named David Schwartz, who I think you're responsible for. So if you guys want to take him, we'll take Kevin Hovind or that. Can arrange that afterwards. Now, I did a lot of research for this show called A Current Affair with respect to this product, and basically they wanted a scientific point of view, and I just told you all the things that is wrong with this product. And so they did a 7-minute story which they cut and they sat on the shelf, and it's still sitting on the shelf. Now, the thing that happened in this instance was the executive producer was replaced halfway through the story, and so that story is shelved, and who knows whether it would ever see the light of day. And so this happens quite often. The old executive producer also asked me to do a story on detox, because I wrote an article for the Skeptic magazine in Australia about debunking the detox myth, and they wanted to do this on this, you know, mainstream primetime show, and then of course this guy was gone. So, you know, in television that sort of stuff happens. But then there's also the chiropractic situation that happened recently as part of the Simon Singh British Chiropractic Association libel case. Many of you would have heard about this, where Simon Singh, the science writer, has been sued for libel or defamation because he called a particular chiropractic modality bogus. Now, Simon was recently in Australia, and chiropractic in Australia is considered to be mainstream medicine, and like someone mentioned this morning, I think it was Jay Novella, it's actually covered by our health benefits scheme. So alongside, you know, going to the dentist and getting glasses, they cover chiropractic and acupuncture, and that's a different, you know, problem. But so most people in Australia didn't realise that chiropractic is good for some sorts of lower back pain, but for other things like colic, for example, which was the subject of the Simon Singh case, there's no evidence. So I did a lot of research for the ABC, which is the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, and they're a government television station, and they did an absolutely explosive report on the claims made by chiropractors and why they are not based in science and why there is no evidence and why they can be dangerous. And it was one of those situations where you're sitting in front of the TV going, yes, yes, yes. So in that was a good experience. But the main part of my work involves the anti-vax lobby in Australia. And I think that the major difference between what we deal with in Australia and what you guys deal with here is we're doing it in the reverse order, and that is that the anti-vax lobby was really going under the radar in Australia for a very long time. They were small, but they were noisy and they were powerful. And as Paul said this morning, they scare people, and then people are very hard to unscare. So what we're doing as part of our campaign is exposing them and exposing their misinformation and basically they're lies, and that's really the only way to describe what they do. So this all started when a 4-week-old baby died of whooping cough. We currently have a pertussis whooping cough epidemic in Australia. We've had 8,000 cases reported in the last 12 months as opposed to 800 in the previous 12 months. There have been 3 babies under the age of 12 months who have died from pertussis. And this epidemic is concentrated in an area of New South Wales which is the home to the sort of the hippie population. It's on the north coast where there are beautiful beaches and people go to smoke drugs and just chill out and, you know, sit under a teepee and go hum. But there's also this group called the Australian Vaccination Network. Now, first of all, that's a misleading name. They all do that. I know that some of the American bodies do that too. They're the anti-vax lobby. And after the death of this 4-week-old whose name is Dana McCaffrey, this became news, and we're not used to this in Australia, and I don't think many of us are. We don't expect responsible scientific journalism, particularly from commercial television stations. So this was free-to-air commercial TV. And they did a really, really good article on their Sunday night sort of 60 Minutes show exposing the anti-vax lobby and explaining the dangers of not vaccinating your children. And that was sort of the starting off point for the media in Australia taking a role in dealing with this bunch of people and trying to expose them to the public. And so my role in particular has been to provide information to journalists. There's been a consistent campaign for probably the last 6 to 8 months now. This has involved press, it's involved television, it's involved radio, and it's been a concerted effort by a whole bunch of us who are all connected by the web, by Twitter, by Facebook. And once we have an issue, whether that be someone is anti-vax on the radio or someone's written to the paper saying that vaccines cause autism or shaken baby syndrome or SIDS or whatever is, you know, their new thing. In fact, squalene's their new thing now. You've probably heard about that, John. They love it. So we've got a concerted group of skeptics now that we can mobilise at any minute to counteract these sort of things. But we're lucky in the sense that the media is on our side in that sense because we got in early. Unlike what's happening here, where they tend to sort of side with the anti-vaxxers. We do obviously have the false balance, which we're going to talk about a bit later. But the work I've been doing on my blogs has been really important in providing information to journalists. The thing that I found that they really want is they need immediate access to information. So they'll call me, they say, I've got a deadline in an hour. I say, right, go to this blog, look here, here's the link, you'll find everything you need there, and then call me. And that's worked really well to disseminate information rapidly to journalists. So just to finish up, I got home last night from Skeptics in the Pub, which we had just down the street from here, and I had an email from the mother of Dana McCaffrey, the 4-week-old who passed away from pertussis, and it seems that the anti-vaxxers have suffered another blow in the last 24 hours, which I'm very pleased to report. They are now pleading for money because they've had advertisers pull out of their magazine. They have a monthly magazine. Yeah. Yeah, so they are running out of money, they're running out of momentum, and they are getting shot down from every angle that we can possibly get them on. And I've had journalists ask me this in the past. They've said, what is your aim? Do you want to shut them down? Now, we don't want to shut them down. Of course, I'd like to see them shut down, but there's the whole issue of freedom of speech. Although in Australia, in fact, the laws for freedom of speech do not apply to corporations, but that's another story. I don't particularly want to shut them down. You can say what you like, but what we want to do is we want to expose that what they're saying is wrong and it's lies and it's spreading misinformation. And we also want people to just walk away from them. If we can expose them for what they're doing as wrong and then parents go, okay, I know that that's not the right information and walk away, then they will just collapse under their own weight. And it looks like this is the start of that if they're now getting to a point where they're saying, please give us money. Oh, and I work for a pharmaceutical company. According to them.
Thank you. Thank you for bringing a ray of sunshine into all of our discussions, Laura. That is excellent. Next up, Dr. John Snyder is Chief for General Pediatrics and Medical Director of Pediatric Ambulatory Care at St. Vincent's Hospital here in New York City. He's also Assistant Professor of Pediatrics at New York Medical College, a Fellow of the American Academy of Pediatrics, and the founding partner of Pediatric Associates of St. Vincent's, a multi-specialty pediatric practice also here in New York City. Since 1994, Dr. Snyder has been active in the education of pediatric residents and medical students with a particular interest in evidence-based pediatrics. We may hear more about that. You may already be likely to be familiar with his work as a contributor to the Science-Based Medicine blog, where his main area of interest is medical myth and the ways in which parents use information, positively or negatively, in making medical decisions for their children. In that capacity, he lectures quite frequently on the vaccine myth. Dr. Snyder.
Thank you very much. I too feel short, but that's not unusual for me. We need you here, basically, and all of your superheroes friends from Australia, because we're not as fortunate here. I think we're a bit behind where you are in Australia. We still are in a lot of trouble when it comes to the vaccine fear-mongering that we're all familiar with. I was going to read from these notes, but I'm not going to because Paul Offit stole all of my material. So, and if those of you who missed that part, you missed a great talk. But I came at this topic and became interested in the media and the way it affects parental decision making because I'm there on the front lines with kids. And I would say about 6, 7, close to 10 years ago now, the way I practiced pediatrics changed pretty dramatically. And I attribute that to not one thing. I would say Andrew Wakefield, who we heard about earlier, is primarily responsible, but I would put a significant amount of the blame on the media. So I'm not going to go through the story. I think all of you know and heard Paul Offit's discussion about Andrew Wakefield. We all know who he is. We saw his picture. Everyone recognized him. We didn't recognize the Nobel laureates, but we recognized him. So I'm not going to go through the whole story. But suffice it to say, around the time that article came out, it hit the UK first because that's where the big story was. It took a little bit of time for it to reach our shores, but very soon after it became very difficult to convince parents, something we never used to have to do, that vaccines were really important for their kids. They knew they were important, but now they were really worried that maybe they're not as important and maybe the side effects might just be more important. And as the news media picked up on this, problems got much worse. And of course, there are the anti-vaccine groups like the National Vaccine Information Center, a great name for an anti-vaccine group, smallish, but very vocal, and unfortunately getting larger. And when you have a compliant media who's willing to tell their story, all of a sudden the news gets out pretty fast. So it didn't take long for the practice of pediatrics to change pretty dramatically after Wakefield's early report, as it was called, came out on his 12 children in The Lancet in 1998. So part of the routine of the office visit, a very significant part, became convincing parents that vaccinating was important. Most of the time we succeeded. It took a lot more time and effort than we really had to give to it, but sometimes it wasn't as effective, and sometimes parents decided to wait or maybe not vaccinate at all. So things changed a lot, and that was 10 years ago, and I unfortunately will tell you that things have not gotten better, they've gotten worse. So I was actually going to talk about, I did a blog post recently for SBM on the Dateline episode that Paul Offit talked about earlier. I actually called him after that Dateline to ask what his take on it was, and I was surprised to hear that he thought it was a pretty good piece. He's not here now to defend himself on that, but no, he had obviously criticisms of it, but he thought it could have been worse, and I agree it could have been worse, but I thought it was pretty vile. So I thought I would talk a little bit about, did anybody see the Dateline piece here? I don't know if some people saw it. It was Dateline NBC. It was called A Dose of Controversy. And again, the title should give it away right there. I would call it a dose of false controversy. Because again, it spun it as if there was a scientific or a medical controversy about the MMR autism link, when in fact, we all know that there is absolutely no scientific controversy whatsoever. And I guess had it not been for the media, Wakefield's report probably would have been relegated to the dustbin of science, voodoo, and quackery. We never would have heard from it again. Unfortunately, the media spun it, and we've seen many shows here in the United States talking about this, and I've never seen a good one. So the fact that you stood up and applauded when you saw that show is something I've never experienced here. And I was hoping that maybe the Dateline piece might have been that. So what they did was they interviewed, it was the first ever in this country, and maybe anywhere, interviewed Andrew Wakefield. So what did they do? They had Andrew Wakefield. They spent, I'd say, about 80% of the time discussing Wakefield and his beliefs, I will call them. They did do some good things. They interviewed Paul Offit. They interviewed Brian Deere, who was the British investigative journalist who really broke open the dark underbelly of Andrew Wakefield and his fraud and his conflicts of interest. So they did do that. They did, again, talk about some of Andrew Wakefield's conflicts of interest, that he was paid large sums of money by the lawyer who represented the kids in his study. I'm not going to, again, go into all the details. Go to Brian Deere's website and you'll see amazing amounts of eye-opening information. But what they didn't do was talk about the science. So they didn't spend a lot, they flashed up some journals and said, oh, this, the science has shown that there's not a lot behind this, but that was pretty much a flash on the screen. Really what they focused on was Andrew Wakefield, his charismatic persona talking about his beliefs. They didn't talk about the volumes and volumes of science that, first of all, disproved his original paper in 1998, showed it to be the fraud that it was. They didn't talk about the amazing amounts of information, of literature data that shows that all of Wakefield's prior beliefs were also disregarded. So before the 1998 piece came out, he tried to prove that measles infection caused inflammatory bowel disease. Well, that failed. He tried to show that the measles vaccine caused inflammatory bowel disease. That failed. Then the 1998 paper came out purporting to show that the MMR vaccine could potentially cause both a new variant inflammatory bowel disease in kids and autism. We know that that was complete garbage. The Dateline piece didn't really talk about any of that stuff. It didn't talk about the volumes of data that showed that there is no such thing as autistic enterocolitis, yet that's the sort of the hallmark of this new syndrome that Andrew Wakefield is talking about. They didn't discuss that at all. So, it failed on many, many levels. I would say one of the biggest failures, though, was to not talk about the sort of the carnage that was left in the wake of Andrew Wakefield, so to speak. And that is the way it affected parents and their understanding and beliefs about how to take care of their kids. So one man, I guess, supported and buoyed up by the media and some small but very vocal anti-vaccine groups, really affected the way kids are cared for in this country and around the world. And so what happened? Well, right after the paper came out in the UK, there were epidemics of mumps and measles, and kids became very sick, and some died. This is not hard to understand, right? We know that as soon as herd immunity drops even a small amount, we're going to have outbreaks of disease. Well, it didn't drop a small amount in the UK. It went from 92%, the vaccination rate against measles, mumps, or rubella went from 92% before the publication of his quack article to, in some areas, 30% in some areas outside of London, the average being somewhere in the 70 to 80% area. Well, anytime it drops significantly below 90%, we are going to see outbreaks. So there were outbreaks and there were deaths. And it didn't take long for that to spread around the world. So in Italy, we saw outbreaks. Here in the United States, we saw an outbreak, massive outbreak of mumps. And, just in the past few years, outbreaks of measles again, right here in our backyard in Brooklyn, in parts of Manhattan. And around the country, we're seeing diseases that we have not seen since we started vaccinating against them. Paul Offit mentioned Haemophilus influenza type B, okay? Most parents don't know what that is, but prior to the vaccination, 1 in 200 children under the age of 5 were horribly afflicted with invasive disease by this bacterium. 1 in 200 kids under 5. And now it doesn't exist. But as recently as last year, we saw some blips in the radar screen, and 5 or 6 cases here, 6 or 7 cases there, and a few deaths. All in unvaccinated kids. Kids where the parents said, I don't think I'm going to vaccinate, I'm a little concerned. Now that's not all due to Andrew Wakefield, but it's due to the sort of domino effect that occurred after Andrew Wakefield. And all the people, all the mavericks and the celebrities and the vocal anti-vaccine groups that jumped on the bandwagon after that. And so one individual publishing really a piece of crap in a very prestigious journal completely debunked by science. And science has washed its hands of this issue completely. There is nothing to talk about anymore. There is no controversy. There really was never a significant controversy because as soon as the article was published, it was pretty clearly a piece of garbage from a scientific perspective. But that one article and then the sort of the fallout after that is all supported by the media. And again, I talked about the Dateline piece, but prior to that, there are just endless numbers of horribly distorted media pieces about this subject. And if we have some time later in the panel, we can talk about that.
Good. Thank you. Thanks. John Snyder. Thank you very much. Thanks, John. Thank you for driving home sort of what the real-world import of some of this sort of thing is. Speaking next is somebody coming from a whole different side of this whole issue is Howard Schneider, who's the founding dean of the School of Journalism at Stony Brook University, which he comes to after an illustrious 35-year career as a reporter, managing editor, and chief editor at Newsday. Under his leadership, the paper won 8 Pulitzer Prizes and was a pioneer in expanding newspaper journalism to the web and to TV and radio. In 2003, Howard was the recipient of the Columbia Graduate School of Journalism Alumnus Award. He has been a member of the Pulitzer Prize judging panel 3 times. That's no mean accomplishment in its own right. And he also serves on the Science Journalism Advisory Board of the Woods Hole Biological Laboratory. Howie Schneider.
So let me note 3 things by way of introduction. First, it's very nice to be here, and I thank you. One, as a journalist, I consider myself a skeptic by temperament and by professional training, embodied by what we tell the young journalism students at Stony Brook, which is, if your mother tells you that she loves you, check it out. And that's the ethos we try to inculcate in young journalists. Second thing I want to tell you is how this vaccination debate is playing out at Stony Brook. We all returned 2 weeks ago to the campus, and as you would imagine, the big question on campus is how to deal with the reemergence of swine flu. We now have more than 2,000 cases of swine flu at American universities, and every university has a plan. So we have these posters all over the campus, and the posters say, visitors are welcome, but the flu is not. And it tells you what to do about it. And I was walking through an academic building about a week and a half ago, and all of a sudden I saw scrawled across one of these posters, forced vaccination is genocide. Okay. About 2 days later, I'm walking through the same academic building, and suddenly there's a note that's now taped to the poster. And the note says, to the intelligent persons who destroyed the poster, obviously you cannot read since the sign says nothing about vaccinations. If vaccines did not exist, half of the world's population would be dead or physically crippled. Where is the proof that vaccines cause autism? Get a life, okay? So that's what passes for civil discourse at many of our... The third thing I'm going to say may not make my colleagues on the panel very happy, because I am going to disagree with them, or certainly challenge some of the assumptions that they make about the news media. I am not here as an apologist or a defender of everything that the news media in America does. And there is some very bad journalism being practiced. There's bad science being practiced. And I'm not going to defend Matt Lauer and everything he did on Dateline. But I want to tell you a couple of things. The first thing is that this notion that the news media is now giving false equivalency to both sides of every debate in America is way overstated. We get that criticism from people on climate change, on creationism and evolution. Why do you give equal weight to two sides when the evidence overwhelmingly supports a position? And I think this is a broad brush criticism of the news media that is unfounded. If you go read carefully and you watch television carefully, you will find in most cases that is not accurate. For example, last February, when the federal court ruled on the claims of the vaccine parents who claimed that they had a link to autism and they wanted damages, and the court ruled, as you know, there is no evidence. If you go back and look at CBS, CNN, New York Times, all of the reports that day, overwhelmingly, the amount of material in those reports dealt with the fact that there was no evidence to support this, and this had been determined before, and this kind of reinforced it. Dr. John Pook, who is the medical correspondent of CBS, said to Katie Couric, listen, we've got to get beyond this link business and focus on the diagnosis and the treatment of autism. This is a waste of time. The New York Times reported, public health experts generally agree that after clean water and flush toilets, the most important health advances in history have been vaccinations. So the weight of evidence in many of these reports clearly came down on what scientists and public health experts had said. And Americans seem to be getting the message. Last big poll I could find, 2008, found that about 71% of American parents felt that the benefits of vaccination clearly outweighed any of the potential risks. 66% of the population said that they are seriously concerned about the fact that parents are not vaccinating their children. Now, you can argue that still leaves a pretty significant gap. That leaves, it was 19% of the parents who were worried about vaccinations. And on this count, I would submit to you that our focus here, the news media being the lightning rod for this, is misplaced. And if we continue to focus just on that issue, we are not going to solve the problem of how to get good information to the public. And I think it's a problem. But I think there are other very powerful forces at work. And if we don't recognize them and deal with them, we're not going to solve the problem. Force number one, everything has a context. We are sitting here in the midst of the most profound communications revolution in 450 years. We know it. We know the internet is a tremendous blessing and curse. We know it amplifies information and disinformation. The Pew Foundation and the California Health Foundation did a study last year of where health consumers go for information. The first place they go is the internet. Many of those consumers bypass the news media altogether to get their information. Two, a majority of those people not only go to the internet, they go to other health consumers for advice and suggestions, with no understanding of whether those health consumers are authoritative or not, or passing on legitimate information or not. So we have a lot of confusion here that's being amplified between information and disinformation. And I would submit to you that one of the biggest problems we have is not the news media, although we've got problems, it's the audience. We are not training the audience to be more analytical. We're not training the audience to be more critical. We're not training people now to understand in this world of surplus information, it is imperative that they learn themselves how to critically look at what they're getting. At Stony Brook, we just started a program called News Literacy on how you know you're getting the truth from the news media. And we're teaching it to 10,000 students from every discipline on campus in an effort to deal with the problem of educating in the news consumer in the digital world. And it's not just the information and disinformation, It's the sheer volume of information. 10,000 new blogs and websites being created every hour around the world. 10,000. What happens when we are overwhelmed with information? I'd submit to you two things happen. We have so much information, it's harder to understand what's true. The grip on the truth is being loosened, not tightened. Uncertainty becomes more of a factor. Anxiety becomes a factor in the face of this information. And the second danger, which psychologists will talk to you about, is what happens when we get too much of anything. What happens to us? How do we react? We become passive. We become numb. So at a time when news consumers and information consumers should be most vigilant, they are becoming passive because of the overload of information. Force two, the autism battle, just like the battle about creationism, is a very emotional battle. And I know that many of these parents are bewildered, pained, hurt, don't understand why their children get sick, and they are turning for some answers in the face of not having those answers, and they turn to things that they would like to believe are potentially true. It's something outside of us. It's not genetic. It's something that's simple. It's somebody else's fault. And now force two we're facing is cognitive dissonance, which we all know about. Most of us are not open. This group is very different than the general population. Most people are not open to information that challenges their own belief system. They reject it. They look for confirmation bias. They look for people to reinforce their views. And that's not only happening in health. Look at what's happening politically in America. Why do you think that tens of thousands of people believe that Barack Obama was not born in America? Although my favorite part of this recent poll was that 6% don't believe he was born in America, so they don't think Hawaii is part of America. But that's a whole other story, right? That's a whole other story. Why do we have such polarization? The internet just amplifies the ability to have conspiracy theories. 1/3 of Americans in a poll in 2007, and this is so relevant because of the anniversary we had this week, 1/3, 33% said our government knew about 9/11 in advance and either didn't do anything about it or actually participated. 16% said we used explosives to blow up the World Trade Center as a cover for going in to declare war in Iraq. And if you look at who those people are, they disproportionately get their news from the internet, if news is what they get. These are very powerful forces we're dealing with. And the third thing I think we're dealing with goes to the heart of the role of scientists. So there was a recent survey by the AAAS, and Pew, looking at how scientists view the news media, okay? And 85%, this was released 3 months ago, 85% of the scientists in America said that they think that ignorance, public ignorance of health and science is a major issue, and they blame the news media. They think many of the stories are insufficient, they're oversimplified. What percent of the scientists who felt this way ever talked to a reporter? Can anybody want to guess? Raise your hand. What percentage of the scientists who felt this way talked to reporters? 5%. 3. And I'm not trying to deflect attention here from the news media. I'm saying there are other factors here as important that we're not addressing. Who is addressing the question of whether scientists feel that they have a responsibility as public citizens, not be advocates, but certain to be powerful information tellers? Are they trained? Are they given instruction in how to do this? Do they feel that they're public citizens and they have a responsibility? At Stony Brook, we've also started this Center for Communicating Science, in which we're trying to teach the next generation of scientists, it's a big research university, how to effectively communicate with the public officials, and with the press. And I've been talking to graduate students. We have 1,700 science graduate students. And some of them think this is a terrible idea. Why do I have to communicate? What's the point? So I think when you look at this issue of why people are getting disinformation and why in the face of rational evidence there are still people who resist, I just think we have to address a lot more questions than the role of the news media. Anyhow, thank you.
Good. Thank you, Howie. Thanks for defending journalism, but also I think for also throwing out something that makes some good provocative room for potentially some sort of further discussion and argument here. Let me at this point do two things. First of all, let me invite up Carl Zimmer. Carl Zimmer, you probably know his name already. He's yes, one of the best science writers around, and may I say, as somebody who has a deep, long-term fascination with the subject of symbiosis, Carl probably knows more about parasites than anybody in the world you would actually still like to sit next to on the bus. Okay, so that was great. So thank you, Carl, for joining us here, and thanks. Terrific setup for everything so far. So keying off of a couple of things, Howie, that you had said. You had made a point that you think that that the issues of false balance may often it's too broad a brush, that it's applied probably more often that it's not the root cause of a lot of problems. That said, I mean, I think there is a question of that. You're saying that the merits of a lot of these articles are that oftentimes the weight of evidence is exactly where it should be in terms of coming down on this. I guess the question I want to throw out is weight of evidence sufficient? Is it enough? Does it leave that sort of that crack in there that, for example, where you still manage to come in with a, say, pro forma quote from somebody on the other side of things? Does that manage to keep non-controversies alive in some way? And is that journalistically irresponsible, or is that just what's going to happen unless they become advocates for a particular position?
I would tell you that we have a responsibility to indicate that there is another side, not to give it equity in weight. If thousands of Americans are not vaccinating their children, as John said, we've got to indicate that in the story. There are people not vaccinated. Our job is not, in referring to Rachael, to take sides. Our job is to try to give people information, as much information we can about this issue to empower them. And I will tell you that it's absolutely relevant to talk about in a story about vaccinations that there's a big anti-vax campaign, that there are people not vaccinating their children, and why, in the face of the evidence that's been presented, why that's going on.
Rachael, John, do you agree with that?
I would agree with everything you said. Everything.
Okay.
Even that the New York Times, and I remember reading very, very closely the paper after the omnibus ruling, the papers, and seeing and being very thankful that at last, I felt it was at last, the media actually reported very well on the issue. I think actually the media does a good job at reporting when news comes out, whether it's, on the other side or not. So for example, when we started to get measles outbreaks in Brooklyn, all over the papers, measles outbreaks, parents not vaccinating, I mean, that came out. But I think what the issue with the false balance is, the problem is, and you're right, the audience is responsible ultimately. I think people take the dominant message that comes out from a piece, whether it's in print or on TV. If they hear the words MMR and autism together, that's what they take home. They don't take home the nuances. They take home often the main theme. The theme is MMR has been linked to autism. Science is divided. That's what they hear. You could look at the Dateline piece and find some very good parts of it, some good aspects to the actual, I'm not going to call it journalism, but the story. But ultimately, I think people saw a really charismatic guy in Andrew Wakefield, heard a lot about his theory, and came away from it hearing some scientists think this, but Andrew Wakefield has a very strong feeling about his theory, and maybe he's got something there. And unfortunately, that's the level at which the audience takes their information, even if the balance was fair. Now, what happens often is the media confuses fair with equal. And they'll put two people on and they'll think, well, it's fair and balanced, right? But actually, I think the fairness would, if they had done their homework, they would have, and Dateline NBC had done their homework, what they would have done is talked about how it's possible that Wakefield could be continuing to believe and practice the way he does? And how is it possible that this myth, 10 years later, still lives? That's the story. They could have talked about Wakefield in the context of the narrative of the story, but to spend all that time with Wakefield himself and a few minutes with Paul Offit, I think that was a problem.
Rachel?
Yeah, I'm shaking my head because I have to say I don't agree with you. I think that if there was a story about the Holocaust, you wouldn't give equal time to Holocaust deniers, and you wouldn't give equal time to flat earthers. And when you look at the things that the anti-vaxxers believe, apart from the nonsense about autism and SIDS and shaken baby syndrome and brain damage and cancer and seizures, there's no evidence for what they're saying. And as John says, you know, if you're a parent and you're listening to a show, even if they get 5 minutes as opposed to 30 minutes from science, scientists will get up and talk about statistics and figures and facts, but the emotive side of the anti-vax issue is so much more effective in conveying scaremongering to parents.
But I just want to interrupt and say, I'm not suggesting that there's equity in all these stories. And in a Holocaust story, we are not going to give equal balance. You know, we tell the students in this news literary class that there are times you give a story balance. There's a dispute between two sides. There's no evidence who's right or wrong, or there's a Republican and Democratic debate, and you're going to do that. But fairness is different. When we talk about fairness, we tell the students you need to be fair to the evidence. And so that's what the journalists are doing. So I'm not defending equity in all this, and that's not what I'm saying is going on.
But if I can jump in, because I'll acknowledge these are especially in practice, they get to be very complicated, muddy issues about how to do these things, especially under deadline and all the rest. But I guess one of the interesting questions, because there are certainly journalists interpret their responsibilities, and even the question of whether they have responsibility in a lot of different ways. There are certainly, I think, a lot of people, I think, very responsibly would say exactly what you're talking about, and I think, in fact, you're right. Certainly, at most places that are practicing anything like good journalism, they're doing it exactly the way that you're talking about. It's not equal time. It's the tricky question, I think, that comes in there is that question of how much when journalists, when they're shaping their stories, there is a certain gatekeeper function in that, and I think it's also what makes it, sometimes when we discuss these things, what can lend itself to an oversimplification of these things is that it's not like there's always just a matter of just two sides. And it's a question of, well, do you have this one? Do you just present this side and ignore the other side? There are always many different variations, and I think even journalists who, in the best tradition of what you're talking about, are trying to responsibly represent at least the fact that there is something else, there are always some points of view that get left out. There's other, every science story, we're not constantly, getting quotes from guys who are still saying, I'm not sure I actually believe in the existence of atoms. There's always a point at which the journalists and the larger operation are making points where they're making that sort of cutoff. But partly it goes to that question of at what point do you have to become, whether you want to or not, is there a way for you to be impartial?
Absolutely.
Without becoming an advocate.
Absolutely. But in the case of the autism debate, I don't think we can censor or pretend that there is not some level of controversy because we have parents who are not vaccinating their children. Mm-hmm. I also think this idea that there may be an emotional 3 minutes of a video, that's what the audience remembers, that gets to the point which I talked about earlier. We've got to train the audience. You can't expect a journalist to eliminate that piece because maybe if I include this emotional comment from a mother who's very upset deep into my story, that's going to be the only thing that these news consumers remember, and I have to take that out of the story. I can't do that.
Let me just bring Carl into the conversation at this point, if I can. Thank you.
I was just going to say that I think that with the vaccine controversy, journalists need to understand that there are some people who are trying to play them. That there are some people who have recognized some of the inherent weaknesses of how journalism works and are trying to exploit that. And I think some journalists who discovered this to their displeasure a few years back when there was a court trial about creationism. And they kind of went about it like a political story or a cultural story, and they talked to both sides. And then after a while they realized that they were being played. And that there were people who were trying to just convince them that there was a controversy, not really distinguishing between a scientific controversy and maybe, I suppose you could call it a cultural one. And then once people once you start reporting it that way, then a lot of people will feel like, okay, I have an excuse to feel about this the way I want to feel, because they're all divided. And it does seem like the reporting, some of the reporting on the vaccine story hasn't wised up to that.
There's so much great stuff that is on the table. I hate to jump in on it, but to be fair to the audience, because I know they've got a lot of questions, and I imagine that some of them are likely to pose exactly the same kinds of questions and so forth that I think we'd like to draw out with one another. Let me at this point start to invite people to come up to the microphone. If you queue up there, and we're certainly going to try to get in a good 15 minutes or so, at least, of a little more discussion about all of that. But terrific job so far, everybody. So let's see. First up, yes, sir.
Hi, my name is John Olta. I'm a graduate student in neurobiology, and this is first I want to make a comment to Mr. Schneider, because you said that 85% of scientists that were interviewed thought the media did not give, I can't remember exactly what it was, but did not give too much weight to the science.
No, what I said was that of the 85% of the scientists who complained about media coverage, only 3% had routinely ever talked to a reporter. That's what I...
Okay, right. And my comment about that was, I work on some esoteric little piece of the puzzle of something that's basic research. And not always is that of interest to the public. So I think you probably see a higher percentage if people were actually going after not just big name famous scientists in certain fields that people are interested in. Tends to be science books tend to be either about the origin of the cosmos and the universe, or something to do with directly applying to humanity. And something esoteric like what I work on is pectoral fin coordination in larval zebrafish. It's not something that's easily sold as an interesting subject. I mean, I can go there if I want, but it's not easily sold, So I'm not going to be called up and asked anytime soon if I want to be interviewed for something. So I just want to make a comment on that. But you're right. My next point is actually contradicting myself. There is... It does seem to be a reticence to actually engage with the public in science. Partially because you have too much other stuff to do just to get grants. Partially because there's some arrogance. And other times people just don't care. But so the question actually is more for Carl Zimmer, because you've interacted a lot with scientists and you do a lot of science writing. How can we help get away from that?
Well, first of all, you have to realize that pectoral fin movement in zebrafish can actually be quite cool.
I have dedicated a lot of years to it, so.
Well, and why have you? That's the fundamental thing. You have to be able to answer that to yourself in plain English, and then you can tell other people. And you also have to think in terms of of people who don't know much about anything in science. I mean, part of the problem we've been talking about here is that these shows like Dateline don't get a lot of viewer mail saying, this was ridiculous, your statistics were all off, or something like that, because there isn't a lot of knowledge of statistics in the general public. I mean, just as a digression, my solution, better high school science education, but enough said. That was a cheap fishing for applause. No, but to answer your question, here's an example. Okay. I gave a talk at Brown recently, and I met some biologists who study the flight of bats, and they have to use high-speed video to do it. And there are actually a lot of things we don't know about how bats manage to do what they do. And so this digital video is just part of what they use for their research. And they're showing me the movies, and they're kind of talking on about various aspects of thruster lift, and I'm completely hypnotized by these movies. And I said, you've got to send me these. So I embed them in my blog and write about the real science. And it was a huge response. Incredible. I mean, people just loved it. And because it was just intrinsically cool, I got an email from one of the biologists later saying, wow, I never thought that what I did was so interesting.
Was that Dan? What's his name? Dan?
So you just have to work on that.
Good. Let's I'd like to move on to, just because, to be fair to everybody. Yes?
I'm Barry Leva. I'm a computer software researcher. And I have 3 points about the media's responsibility part of things. One is that you choose, and I don't mean you personally, I'm saying the media in general. You choose what to cover. You do not have to cover every time someone stands up and says, vaccines hurt our children, or our president was not born in America. And what I consider to be the excessive coverage of those sorts of arguments is a choice the media makes. Point two, you do have a responsibility to report that there is a controversy, but I believe you also have a responsibility to report that the controversy is a social one, not a medical or scientific one. And that message does not get in there, so people leave with the thought that there is a medical controversy, and it needs to be very clearly stated that it's not. And three, there are things that transcend opinion and become fact that you don't need to call somebody up to rebut. The media can state as a fact, as part of the article or as part of the interview, that there is no medical evidence, or even stronger, that there are numerous studies showing no correlation between vaccines and autism, and that message is not stated in most of the coverage. And so then the question is, do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, any quick response to any of that? Thank you.
I would like, I know it was pretty much directed at you, but I would like to answer. I think that was an excellent point. You know, the idea of balance in the media is primarily a very noble one. I think it works in many situations, and like you mentioned, political and social and cultural issues. Science, you know, science is the arbiter of the truth here, and the media is not. The media is there to report and to inform. Science has made the determination that there is no link between the MMR vaccine and autism, as good as science can do it. Now, because of the null hypothesis, we're never going to be able to say that the MMR vaccine cannot cause autism. It doesn't, it never has, but that's just the way science works. We'll never be able to say that. But as good as we can, science has determined that this vaccine does not cause autism. That's done with. Now it's the media's role to understand that and to report that fact. Now, they can talk about Andrew Wakefield, they can even interview Andrew Wakefield, but that has to be in the context of a discussion about what the science says. And the unfortunate thing is that we end up spending so much time talking about the cultural or the pop cultural controversy over this issue that we actually bury the science.
Can I jump into this, because I think I'm going to anticipate what Howie's probably going to say about this. You make important points in there that I would agree with too, but I think there's a line in there that I think it's possible that it starts to slide. That is, you're right. The science is determining the actual factual realities of some of these kinds of issues, but it's not just the job of the press to be reporting on the factual realities of those issues. They, in fact, do have a mandate to report on some things that do go beyond that. And is it necessarily the case that simply because, you know, even if when it is very, very clear cut that the scientific reality is all one thing and there is no controversy about it, how much does that become the compelling argument for the journalists when they're making decisions about that they should not acknowledge, or in what ways should they acknowledge, the fact that there is still this social controversy, ill-informed though it may be? Yeah, Howie.
You know, can I just make one more comment? I would, and then I'm going to let you talk.
Because that was a great point, Howie.
But that's a great point. I mean, that's what I said before. I think the story, really interesting story, and I have to say I've never heard it done. I've never heard it done. The really interesting story is this socio-cultural controversy. That's a fascinating story. It's an important story. It's an incredibly dangerous story to talk about. Actually, that would be very captivating TV. I don't know why it hasn't been done. I mean, the story, Dateline could have done that. They didn't need to just focus on Wakefield and his theory.
Just quickly, 2 or 3 things, and we'll move on. Just to repeat, if you can leave with one notion, we're not talking about balance here. We're talking about fairness, difference. We're not talking about equity in the amount of information. We're talking about, in the name of fairness, do you go ahead and acknowledge that, in fact, there is controversy beyond the science? Most good pieces of journalism will acknowledge in these stories, and I've seen them, a paragraph that indicates the science overwhelmingly has found.
Like you said, it's a paragraph or it's a...
Or two. And the other danger here is talking about the news media. You know, the news media, we got 1,400 daily newspapers. We got hundreds of internet sites. You need to be careful, not you personally, but all of us, in any broad brush indictment of the media on the basis of a piece or 2 pieces. It's just much more complicated. And we live in an open, free society. 2/3 of the world does not have a free press. We pay a price for having a free press, and the price is that we get irresponsible journalism along with the responsible journalism. The remedy, however, having the government or somebody else come in or scientists and arbitrate what gets in the press is far more dangerous. So we have to live with that, and again, I think educate the consumer to be much more critical and understand how to be analytical. And they're not born with this talent, so we got to teach it.
Let's try to go back to the questions here at this point. Ken, thanks.
Hi, I'm Aaron Murray. I'm a global IT specialist for a chemical company, among other things. I guess I was kind of preempted by Carl in the previous questioner, some comments, some questions I wanted to ask. But I guess I wanted to bring up something about the Dateline piece that really stood out to me. When Matt Lauer asked Andrew Wakefield about, he said, can you comment about how the scientific community says that there's no controversy at all? And instead of addressing that, Andrew Wakefield said, what do you mean there's no controversy? We're sitting here and we're talking about it, so that means that there's a controversy. And I thought that was a very striking answer, kind of skirting over the science and just saying, well, you wouldn't be talking to me unless there was a controversy, so obviously there's a controversy. And the other thing that was striking me in that piece was Andrew Wakefield said a few times that his paper did not show any correlation between autism and the MMR vaccine, but yet, he started like this autism organization, and he goes to all these anti-vax conferences and talks about it. So really, I was going to talk about how like these people prey on the media to kind of give the false sense of a real controversy. When
If I can jump in just in the interest of, because we want to try to get at least one more quick question if we can, is I think it is an interesting point about the ways in which, thus it's been acknowledged earlier, the ways in which savvy people on the sides of the foolishness can really manage to take these things. And it is somewhat to the shame of a lot of journalists that you will see this, especially if you watch for it all the time on television, where a journalist will ask a question and the interviewee will answer a completely different question, completely ignore it, and there is no acknowledgement on the part of the questioner that anything sort of peculiar just happened there. There's no sense of, but that's not what I asked you. I mean, I think if we had a lot more journalists who were willing to call out the fact that their own sources were actually trying to duck certain questions, and as somebody who's been through media training, I will tell you, they tell you to do that.
Yeah.
If you do not want to answer a question, answer some other question you'd like to answer.
Yeah.
So, can I just try to get one more quick question out here if we can? Thank you.
Hi, I'm Stephen Packard from Connecticut. This isn't really related to media so much as the vaccine issue. I hear a lot of parents and people who are against vaccines saying it should be an individual right to not vaccinate your kids. But the side you don't hear about that is that, when these kids get sick or something, I mean, in Australia you have nationalized health care. In the U.S., we do have, a lot of people have private insurance, and there are government programs for certain groups. Has there been any effort that, when the kids do get sick, to hold the parents responsible? And I'm not saying deny them health care, but why can't we slap the parents with the bill afterwards? Why do we have to pay for their responsibility? If I assert my right to drive drunk all the time, my insurance company isn't going to pay when I get into a crash and kill somebody, And my other question is, if chiropractors can, sue somebody for saying something bad that they think is going to cause them financial loss, why can't we sue people for wrongful death when they kill a lot of kids with their words?
Can I just say one thing, because Rachel and John are much more qualified to answer the poll on the number of Americans who are upset about the lack of vaccination. 56%, a majority of Americans say that it's the right of a parent to withhold that and not be vaccinated on philosophical grounds. They think that in America, parents have a right to refuse. So there's a big number that support that notion.
Well, and in this country, parents do have a right to refuse, and it does vary by state what the actual clause is, and whether it's a religious exemption or a philosophical exemption, whatever that means. So but there is no state, I believe, where it's mandated. I think they toyed with that actually with one state, but there is basically, it is a parental decision, and I don't think there is precedent yet where this has been tried in a court of law, where a child has been harmed and somebody's brought suit, or a child exposed some other child, and I don't think that's ever been handled in the courts. But it's a fascinating area, and it will happen, because I guarantee you we're going to have these issues rising.
Yeah, in Australia you can apply for a conscientious objector form, and you go to see your GP, and as long as they explain to you the risks of not vaccinating and you still agree to not vaccinate, you get a form signed, and then you still get the money from the government, because in Australia you actually get money if you finish the schedule for vaccination for your children. And the reason for this is to keep up the herd immunity, obviously. But of course the anti-vaxxers scream, oh, it's a bribe, big pharma, all that sort of stuff. But on the topic of being culpable for that sort of thing, there's no precedent in Australia either, but currently there is a complaint submitted to the New South Wales Healthcare Complaints Commission against the anti-vax lobby in New South Wales. That was submitted at the end of August. They had to respond to that. They've now submitted their response. What will happen if they're considered to be in breach of this Complaints Commission clause, they will have to stop saying the stuff that they're saying. They will be told to not talk about autism and vaccines. They'll be not allowed to distribute information that's misleading anymore. Pretty much will cut them off at the knees. And so that's under the inspection at the moment.
Good. Well, I have to say, we have to wrap things up. I'm very sorry we didn't have time to get to still more questions, but I want to thank all of our panelists and all of you for what's been one of the most thoughtful, interesting discussions I've ever seen. Thank you very much.